long before satellites hovered in orbit and wires stretched across continents, before electricity danced along copper lines or cell towers blinked in the dark. There were messages carried by the sky itself, ephemeral puffs of smoke rising gently into the air, then unraveling into the wind. These were not random plumes or campfire haze. They were carefully crafted signals, designed with intent and skill, used by Native American tribes for centuries. In this first chapter, we begin our journey into the world of smoke signals, a subtle, elegant, and ancient form of communication that was both practical and profound. As the fire crackled and smoke curled upward, it became a language all its own, whispered across vast distances by the wind itself. The origins of smoke signaling among Native American peoples stretch so far back in time that no one can say exactly when it began. Like many traditions rooted in oral cultures, its beginning is cloaked in mystery, passed down through memory rather than manuscript. Some believe smoke signals were first used by nomadic tribes on the Great Plains, where the horizon stretched endlessly and the sky provided a perfect canvas. Others suggest they emerged independently in different regions, born of necessity, observation, and the universal human desire to stay connected. What is certain is that by the time European colonists arrived in the Americas, the use of smoke signals was already widespread, sophisticated, and deeply embedded in tribal life. The first principle of smoke signaling was visibility. A signal meant nothing if it could not be seen. So the location of the firebrand, what surrounded it, was chosen with care. Signalers often sought high ground, the crest of a hill, the edge of a bluff, a natural rise above the tree line. These positions allowed the signal to reach far, traveling over valleys and across plains. In places where terrain was flat or visibility was limited, scouts were sometimes positioned in a relay system, stationed every few miles to catch the signal and reproduce it for the next point in the chain. In this way, messages could travel dozens, even hundreds of miles in surprisingly short periods of time. The next essential ingredient was the fire itself. Not just any fire would do. The goal wasn't to burn brightly or generate heat, it was to produce smoke that could be shaped and sustained. To achieve this, Native American signalers used a mixture of dry and green plant material. Dry wood or bark was used to start the flame, and then green leaves, damp grasses, or fresh pine needles were added to produce thick white smoke. The moisture in the green material didn't allow it to burn cleanly. Instead, it smoldered, releasing dense clouds that billowed upward in steady columns. The result was a smoke signal that was not only visible, but could also be manipulated into puffs, lines, or long trails, each pattern with its own specific meaning. Contrary to what popular culture might suggest, smoke signals were not a universal language across all tribes. Just as spoken languages varied widely, so too did the codes used in smoke signaling. The meanings of different puffs, spirals, or intervals could differ depending on region, tribe, and context. A single puff might mean all is well to one group and danger ahead to another. This variability required not only skill in creating the signals, but also cultural knowledge to interpret them. Most often, smoke signals were used within tribes or between allied groups who shared a common system of meaning. Despite these differences, certain types of signals were common across many regions. A steady, rising column might be used to indicate a peaceful encampment or to mark a gathering place. A series of short, interrupted puffs could signal distress or danger. A long, trailing plume might serve as a beacon, guiding hunters or travelers back to camp. Sometimes the very presence of a smoke signal, regardless of its pattern, was enough to send a message announcing presence, establishing territory, or simply reassuring others that someone was near. These signals were not always detailed conversations. Rather, they were bursts of information, like flares in the night sky, meant to alert, instruct, or comfort. For many tribes, smoke signaling was more than just a practical tool. It was an extension of their relationship with the natural world. Fire and smoke were not inert materials. They were living forces, imbued with spirit and meaning. The act of building a fire and sending a signal was often done with a sense of reverence. It required patience, awareness, and respect for the environment. Wind speed, humidity, time of day all had to be considered. A skilled signaler read the sky like a book, waiting for the right moment, adjusting the fire as needed, shaping the smoke as if it were clay. It was as much an art as it was a science. In stories passed down through generations, smoke signals sometimes take on mythic proportions. Elders spoke of smoke that could carry a prayer to the heavens, or warnings that arrived like whispers on the wind. In some tales, the smoke itself seemed to think, to know where it needed to go, bending with purpose across the sky. Whether used in times of war, in moments of joy, or as part of daily life, smoke signals were deeply woven into the spiritual and communal fabric of tribal existence. They were not just tools, they were expressions of identity, tradition, and connection. And so we begin our journey into this ancient art form, not merely as observers of a lost technology, but as listeners to a language of sky and fire. In the chapters to come, we'll delve deeper into how smoke signals were made, what they meant, and how they shaped the lives of those who used them. We'll explore their role in rituals and warfare, their evolution and decline, and the legacy they leave behind. But for now, imagine a clear blue sky over a wide prairie, a lone figure atop a ridge, and a curl of smoke spiraling upward, an ancient message rising on the wind, carrying secrets only a few could read. To understand the brilliance of Native American smoke signals, one must first appreciate the fire beneath the message. While fire is universal, the kind used to create signal smoke required precision, patience, and a practiced hand. The goal wasn't to generate flamet, was to create controlled smoke, rich and thick enough to be seen from miles away, yet pliable enough to be sculpted into meaningful shapes. The very heart of the signal was not the fire itself, but the chemistry of its burn, how heat met fuel, and how moisture balanced flame. This was not chaos, this was craft. The materials used were chosen with meticulous care. Dry kindling, usually small twigs, bark shavings, or dead grass, provided a quick, hot ignition. But once the fire was lit, the signaler's real work began. Damp materials were added, not so wet as to extinguish the flame, but moist enough to smolder and smoke. Fresh green branches from pine, cedar, or leafy shrubs worked well, as did moss, cattails, and certain wet grasses. The moisture content in these materials resisted combustion and instead created that essential heavy smoke. When done correctly, the result was a slow-burning, smoky fire that could be manipulated with remarkable control. But smoke itself is a fleeting medium. To turn it into communication, the signaler needed to shape it, control its release, pattern its movement, and punctuate its rise. This was achieved by interrupting the smoke at its source. A common technique involved covering the fire temporarily with a blanket, animal hide, or woven mat. When lifted, the sudden rush of oxygen sent a puff of smoke upward. In skilled hands, these interruptions became dots and dashes, short bursts, or long trails, similar in concept to Morse code. But unlike dots and dashes on paper, these messages dissolved in seconds, vanishing into the sky. Precision and timing were everything. The physical shape of the smoke mattered greatly. A tall, straight column was the most visible form and often signaled routine messages. "We are here," or "all is well." A short, broken puff was more urgent perhaps, a call for help or a signal to return home. Continuous smoke, unbroken and curling steadily into the air, was usually reserved for longer-term markers, such as guiding a hunting party back to camp or indicating a settlement. By adjusting the timing and spacing of smoke bursts, signalers created messages of surprising variety. If the vocabulary was limited, the nuance came through rhythm and form. The environment played a crucial role in this delicate science. Wind could carry or distort a signal, clouds could obscure it, and rain could make it impossible. Signalers had to read the skies carefully. A light breeze was ideal. It spread the smoke gently without breaking it apart. Strong winds were dangerous. They could scatter a puff before it rose high enough to be seen. Early morning or late afternoon were often the best times for signaling, as the air was still and the light helped contrast the white smoke against the sky. These factors required not just knowledge, but adaptability. The best signalers weren't just firemakers, they were meteorologists, too. Even color played a role. Most signals aimed for dense white smoke, which stood out clearly against a blue or gray sky. To create it, signalers might use grasses or leaves high in moisture or oils. Sometimes, for contrast or symbolic reasons, darker smoke was preferred. This could be achieved by burning certain barks or adding powdered earth to the fire, though less common. In some traditions, black smoke signaled mourning or a call to arms, while white signaled peace. In others, a change in smoke color marked a transition in the message's tone. In addition to shaping the smoke, the signaler needed to position themselves with the broader landscape in mind. Visibility was always the prime directive. Hills and bluffs offered reach, but the direction of the valley and the distance to allies mattered just as much. Signalers often knew the terrain intimately. They were aware not just of where their companions were, but how the signal would look from that perspective. Some even coordinated in advance, pre-agreeing on timing or locations, so that a signal, once sent, would be expected and, thus, noticed. It was less like shouting across a field and more like tapping a code on a shared drum. Tools were sometimes employed to aid the process. Simple fans, made of bark or hide, could help direct smoke. Wooden poles were used to support overhead covers, giving the signaler more control over when the smoke burst free. Stones could be arranged around the fire to shape airflow. Each of these tools contributed to the rhythm and clarity of the message. With practice, signalers could produce uniform puffs spaced seconds apart, or extended columns that lasted for minutes. The ease and grace with which they worked belied the intricacy of their methods. There's a quiet poetry in this kind of signaling, dance of earth, fire, and air. Nothing is written down, nothing is saved. And yet, in those rising plumes, entire stories are told. A hunter signals a successful kill. A scout warns of strangers on the horizon. A village announces a celebration, all with no words, all with smoke. This was not just about utility, it was a performance, ephemeral and elegant, designed to be seen and then forgotten by the wind. But for those who understood it, every puff was a phrase, every column a conversation. In modern times, we are surrounded by invisible signals, cell phone waves, Wi-Fi, satellites humming above us. But they lack the tactile beauty of smoke, the ancient simplicity of a message made from fire and air. Native American smoke signals remind us that communication was once a craft slow, deliberate, and bound to the earth. The science behind it was never just technical. It was intuitive, experiential, and passed down through generations, not in books, but in practice. And though the smoke has long since cleared, the memory of its language lingers in the stories and traditions of those who still remember how to listen to the wind. In an age when our voices can travel across oceans in seconds, and written words appear instantly across glowing screens, it's easy to overlook the elegance of smoke as a means of communication. But for Native American communities spread across wide and varied landscapes, forests, plains, deserts, and mountain, smoke was not just practical, it was brilliant. There's a reason these early peoples turned to the sky and fire to send their messages. They weren't choosing the crude option. They were choosing the one that made the most sense, the one that harnessed nature's elements in a way that was effective, respectful, and deeply symbolic. Imagine standing on the open prairie where the sky arches like a vast blue bowl over the grasslands. Sound carries well, but only so far. Shouting can reach a few hundred feet, maybe more, with a strong voice and still air. Drums and horns might do better, but they're limited by terrain. Forests muffle, canyons distort. Messages need clarity, they need reach. Smoke, by contrast, rises, it climbs. It hovers above trees and hills and keeps going until it meets the wind. It is silent but visible, a quiet message in the sky that can be seen from miles away. And crucially, it doesn't require proximity. One fire in the right place can speak to many eyes. Smoke also lent itself to quick and simple messages. Unlike speech or writing, which require shared language or literacy, smoke signals rely on visual rhythm. A trained observer could understand a signal from afar without hearing a word. It was as close to a visual alarm system as pre-modern technology could allow. 3 puffs, a warning, a long trail, a welcome. Simple codes, taught and passed along, allowed communities to coordinate in ways that were fast and low cost. No wires, no ink, no tools beyond fire and time. In environments where materials were scarce or mobility was key, that mattered. Another compelling reason to use smoke was its neutrality. Unlike a voice, which could be recognized, or a footprint, which could be traced, smoke left no owner. It was a message, not a signature. This anonymity was especially important in times of conflict or tension. A tribe could warn its members of danger without revealing exactly who had sent the signal. It was a way to speak while remaining silent, both seen and unseen, known and unknowable. The signal rose, did its work, then vanished. Nothing left behind but a smoldering ember and a change in the wind. It's also important to remember that many Native American tribes moved often. Some followed herds, others moved with the seasons. A communication method that required wires, roads, or even permanent markers wouldn't work for such mobile societies. Smoke signals, by contrast, could be made anywhere: a hillside, a riverside, even the edge of a forest clearing. All that was needed was some dry tinder, something green to make it smoke, and a place to burn it. It was portable communication, adaptable and immediate. In this way, smoke was a natural extension of a mobile life, always temporary, always in motion. In peaceful times, smoke signals maintained connection. A hunting party could notify the village of their return. Scouts could announce the location of migrating buffalo. Children sent ahead on a trail could reassure parents they were safe. These messages weren't always urgent. Sometimes they were simply gentle reminders that a loved one was still near, still thinking of home. The sight of a rising column on the horizon might stir comfort or pride. It was a community held together, not by walls or fences, but by shared signals rising through the air. In times of danger, smoke became a lifeline. Raiders, wildfires, hostile scouts, any threat could be announced quickly, without needing to run or risk confrontation. Smoke was the sentry's cry, the lookout's trumpet, the first word in a chain of warnings that might save a village before a single arrow flew. In the stillness of early morning or the hush of twilight, a puff of smoke could say more than shouting ever could. It could turn the tide of a hunt, guide warriors to regroup, or prevent a clash altogether. It was both shield and sword, signal and sanctuary. But beyond utility, smoke also had a certain mystique. It was beautiful. The way it danced into the sky, changing shape and color with the wind and sun, was more than functionally, was poetic. Tribes often imbued their smoke signals with meaning beyond the literal. Rising smoke could be a prayer, an offering, a greeting to the spirits. In many cultures, the sky was a sacred space, the realm of ancestors or animal guides. To send a signal skyward was not only to reach fellow humans, but also to touch the spirit world, to speak across realms. Fire was Earth's voice, and smoke its message. There was also a symbolic resonance in the ephemeral nature of smoke. Messages came and went, like breath, like thought. They reminded observers of the fleeting nature of time, the delicacy of life, the constant movement of all things. Watching a signal drift and vanish was not unlike watching a sunset or hearing a bird call across a canyon, beautiful, fleeting, and gone. And yet, in that moment, it meant something. It mattered. This deepened the power of smoke signaling, giving it a spiritual texture that more permanent media could not replicate. So why smoke? Because it worked, because it was beautiful, because it was humble and powerful all at once. For Native American communities, smoke signals were not a fallback. They were a first choice. They embodied the values of simplicity, connection, and respect for the natural world. And as we explore further in the chapters to come, we'll see how this method, deceptively simple yet endlessly meaningful, wove itself into the fabric of daily life, ceremony, conflict, and memory. Smoke was not just a tool, it was a language written on the wind. In a world dominated by spoken language, the concept of a wordless form of communication can seem alien. Yet the beauty of Native American smoke signals lies precisely in this absence of words. They are a form of silent language, without alphabets, without scripts, and without sound. Instead of grammar, they have rhythm. Instead of vocabulary, they have form. And instead of a voice, they have a column of smoke rising through still air, speaking not in sentences, but in signs. This chapter is devoted to understanding that language, not just how it was made, but how it was understood. To the untrained eye, a smoke signal might appear as nothing more than a chance puff from a campfire. But to those who knew its patterns, the difference was obvious. The timing of the signal, the shape of the smoke, the number of puffs, and even the intervals between them all conveyed meaning. These elements were not randomly chosen. They were part of a system passed down through observation, practice, and repetition. In some ways, it resembled music more than writing, structured, expressive, and rhythmically rich. Each signal was a message, composed and performed with care. Although not every tribe used the same smoke language, many employed a similar base logic. A single puff might mean safety or a standard check-in. 2 could signal readiness or a nearby camp. 3, widely recognized across multiple regions, often meant danger or an urgent request for attention. But this basic lexicon could be expanded. The spacing of the smoke bursts, short pauses, long gaps, loud signalers to convey more specific messages, even emotional nuance. For example, 3 rapid bursts might mean immediate danger, while 3 slow puffs could indicate a distant or uncertain threat. In this way, smoke signals operated almost like an analog Morse code. There were no letters, but there were beats. The tempo mattered. A steady, evenly spaced rhythm conveyed clarity and confidence. Erratic or disjointed bursts could signal distress or confusion. These were not just visual signals, they were performances designed to be read across time and distance. To watch a smoke signal rise was not unlike watching a line of poetry slowly disappear into the sky, ephemeral, graceful, and full of meaning, known only to those who shared the code. But the brilliance of this language lay in its adaptability. Because it wasn't bound by fixed symbols or rules, tribes could modify it to suit their needs. A message from a scout returning from a hunt might use one pattern, while a war party on patrol would use another. Even within the same tribe, the codes could shift based on the season, the terrain, or the context. This fluidity made smoke signaling incredibly versatile and difficult to intercept. Outsiders might see the smoke, but without understanding the context, they were left guessing. The message was public, but the meaning was private. It's worth noting that smoke signals were often used in conjunction with other signs. Footprints, ground markings, or even bird calls might confirm or clarify a message. In this sense, smoke was part of a broader system of nonverbal communication that extended through nature itself. The land, the sky, the animals, all played a role in the conversation. A smoke puff rising from a ridge might be echoed by a pattern of broken branches or stones arranged near a trail. The smoke signaled the message. The earth helped interpret it. Together, they formed a complete story. This integration of smoke into the natural world made it feel less like a tool and more like an extension of the environment. It wasn't an intrusion, but a harmony. When a signaler lifted a hide to let out a puff of smoke, they weren't just sending a message, they were shaping the sky, participating in the rhythms of the wind and weather. This act was often done in silence, with focus and intention. There were no loud declarations, no audience applause, just a quiet breath of smoke released to travel across the world. Understanding this language also required deep attentiveness. Those tasked with watching for signals were not idle. They were observers of sky and wind, readers of movement and light. Their eyes were trained to spot subtle changes, to track the path of a plume as it bent and stretched, to note the difference between a cooking fire and a deliberate message. In many tribes, this role was assigned to trusted individuals, those with patience, sharp sight, and good judgment. They became the interpreters of the invisible, the listeners of the sky. Even today, when we study smoke signals, we're reminded of something deeply human: the need to connect, even across distance and silence. The desire to say, "I'm here," or "be careful." or come home without a word. That this could be done with nothing but a fire and a blanket is not a sign of primitiveness, it's a sign of genius. A language that requires no alphabet, a message written in breath, a signal that vanishes but lingers in memory. It is a profound reminder that some of the most beautiful forms of communication leave no trace in the minds of those who understand. Before one could master the intricate variations and meanings of smoke signals, there were fundamentals to learn, core techniques and principles that provided the foundation for more complex communication. These basics were passed down informally through generations, taught by observation, imitation, and practice rather than by written instruction. Young tribe members would watch elders tend fires, time their puffs, and respond to distant signals on the horizon. Over time, the basics became second nature, silent language, learned in the flicker of flames and the hush of open skies. At the heart of any smoke signal was the fire itself. It had to be built carefully large enough to produce a steady stream of smoke, but not so wild that it lost its shape. Typically, a base of dry wood provided the heat, while green or damp plant matter leaves, moss, or pine boughs generated the smoke. This combination ensured a consistent source of dense, visible plumes. Some signalers kept a small fire burning throughout the day, ready to flare up and send a signal when needed. It was a quiet vigil, a readiness to speak to the wind at any moment. Once the fire was established, the signaler would manipulate it, using a covering, often a wet blanket, animal hide, or a woven mat. The purpose of the covering wasn't to extinguish the flame, but to trap the smoke momentarily. When the cover was lifted, a burst of smoke was released, rising sharply into the air. This motion could be repeated, creating a series of discrete puffs. The act required precision and timing. Too slow, and the signal might blur. Too fast, and the message could be misread or lost altogether. It was an art of restraint and rhythm. The most commonly used signals were based on quantity and spacing. A single puff typically served as a basic check-in or a non-urgent notification. It could mean we're here or all is well. 2 puffs often indicated movement, perhaps a hunting party had departed or arrived. 3 puffs, as mentioned before, signaled urgency, danger, distress, or the need for immediate attention. These numerical patterns were often prearranged between parties, especially if tribes worked closely together or needed to coordinate across distances. They kept communication clear and minimized confusion, particularly during moments of high tension. But the spacing between smoke bursts was just as important as their number. Signals with tight spacing, where puffs followed one another, quickly conveyed a different tone than those with long, deliberate gaps. Quick bursts might be read as frantic or alarmed. Slow, measured puffs suggested calm or formality. In some traditions, the signaler would pause between bursts to check wind direction, ensuring that each puff was visible before releasing the next. The process could look almost meditative. Inhale, lift the cover, release smoke, lower weight. It had a rhythm akin to breathing or drumming. Visibility was paramount. The signaler had to be sure that their message could be seen by its intended recipients. This often meant choosing the right location, ideally on high ground with a clear view of the surrounding area. Trees or rocks might be cleared to create an open path for the rising smoke. Some tribes built elevated platforms for signaling, while others used natural vantage points, glyphs, ridges, or hillsides. In flat regions like the Great Plains, visibility might stretch for miles, allowing smoke signals to serve as long-distance communication tools across otherwise silent expanses. Weather conditions also influenced the effectiveness of smoke signaling. Wind could carry a message farther, but also risked scattering it before it could be fully seen. Rain, of course, made fire building difficult and smoke production nearly impossible. Signalers often worked early in the day or in the late afternoon, when light winds and cooler temperatures created the best conditions for smoke to rise in clean, vertical columns. They read the air as sailors read the sea, watching for shifts in wind, changes in humidity, and patterns in cloud cover. Timing a signal correctly often meant the difference between being heard and being missed entirely. In addition to regular signals, there were specialty variations used for unique circumstances. A continuous trail of smoke, produced by letting green material smolder without interruption, might serve as a beacon to guide others back to camp. A spiral effect, though difficult to produce, could be achieved by twisting or funneling smoke through specially constructed chimneys or by using crosswinds. These more elaborate signals were rare, but when seen, they were unmistakable. Their purpose was to capture attention, to announce something extraordinary. It's easy to assume that smoke signals were improvised or casual, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The best signalers practiced often and worked in teams. While one person maintained the fire and controlled the smoke, another might scout for returning signals or prepare the next sequence. It was a collaborative effort, and one treated with seriousness and respect. Mistimed signals or misunderstood patterns could lead to confusion or worse, danger. For this reason, some tribes appointed designated signalers, individuals trained not just in the mechanics of fire, but in the subtle timing and strategy of messaging. By mastering these basics, Native American signalers transformed something as intangible as smoke into a reliable and elegant communication system. They did not need words to express warnings or welcomes, to guide friends or deter enemies. They needed only fire, patience, and an understanding of how to shape breath into meaning. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how this foundation supported even more complex messaging systems, ones that shaped rituals, guided warriors, and defined how entire communities moved and survived. But at the core of it all are these simple, beautiful fundamentals: puff, pause, repeat. The land itself was never a passive backdrop in the story of smoke signals. It was an active participant. Native American smoke signaling was as much about reading and responding to the natural environment as it was about building a fire. Geography shaped every signal: how it was created, how far it traveled, how long it lasted, and who could see it. From the towering peaks of the Rockies to the flat openness of the Great Plains, from forested woodlands to sun-scorched deserts, the terrain offered both opportunity and constraint. In this chapter, we'll explore how the landscape influenced the ancient language of smoke and why geography was as vital to communication as the message itself. On the Great Plains, the wide, uninterrupted horizon was a natural canvas for smoke signaling. With few trees and minimal elevation, the signals had nothing to obstruct their rise. Here, visibility could stretch for miles in every direction, especially on clear days. Tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche used this to their advantage. A single puff from a low fire could be seen far across the grasslands, its purpose instantly understood by watchful allies. These vast open spaces allowed signals to travel far, but they also came with challenges. Winds were unpredictable and could scatter smoke quickly if not managed carefully. Signalers had to account for gusts, breezes, and sudden shifts in air pressure. The skill of working with wind, not against it, was essential. In the forested regions of the Northeast and Pacific Northwest, the dense tree canopy often obscured signals from view. Smoke had to rise above the trees to be seen, which meant fires had to be hotter, longer burning, or positioned at higher elevation. In these environments, tribes often selected natural clearings or rocky outcrops to serve as signal points. Some constructed elevated platforms, like lookouts or watchtowers, to gain additional height. Visibility might be limited to a few miles, so signaling often worked as a relay system. One signaler would send a message to the next hilltop, where it would be read, interpreted, and passed along, again like a message in a bottle, carried from eye to eye across the forested sea. Desert tribes, such as those in the Southwest, had a different set of variables to navigate. The air was dry, the winds could be strong and unpredictable, and natural fuel sources were scarce. Yet the terrain offered spectacular vantage points, mesas, ridgelines, and canyon edges, all of which served as ideal lookout posts. The Hopi and Navajo, for example, often made use of high plateaus to send signals across the barren, sun-baked land. In these stark environments, the contrast of white smoke against blue sky or red rock made signals easier to see, even from great distances. But the heat could be unforgiving, and maintaining a controlled fire required endurance and care. In mountainous regions, the terrain became even more dynamic. A signaler might be perched thousands of feet above the valley floor, but swirling mountain winds and rapidly shifting weather could turn even a well-crafted signal into an unreadable blur. Yet here, two tribes learned to adapt. They used known high points, places where the smoke would rise above the ridge and be visible to distant watchers. They observed how morning mist behaved, how clouds gathered, and how wind moved across the slopes. Some mountain tribes even mapped these air patterns, learning the hidden routes the wind preferred, and choosing signal sites accordingly. Every mountain had its own temperament, and good signalers learned to listen. Coastal and river-based tribes developed unique adaptations of their own. For communities living along large rivers or ocean shores, smoke signals were often used to communicate with fishing boats or to coordinate between villages spaced along a shoreline. Here, the water itself became part of the message. A signal from a cliffside above a bay might tell canoes to return, warn of a storm, or indicate that a feast was being prepared inland. The interplay between sky, smoke, and water added another dimension to the communication. Smoke reflecting on the water, the way it dispersed in coastal winds, these became part of the visual language. Even more subtle geographic considerations came into play. The time of day influenced how smoke looked against the sky. Morning light made pale smoke hard to see, while evening smoke might blend with twilight shadows. Humidity levels changed how long smoke lingered. Cold air might trap smoke low to the ground, making it hard to read. In places where snow covered the land, signalers had to burn brighter or wait for clearer air. This sensitivity to time and place was what made a great signaler stand out. They weren't just lighting fires. They were crafting messages with the full awareness of earth and sky. Because geography influenced signal effectiveness so deeply, tribes often kept mental maps of signal points. These weren't always marked by stone or sign, but remembered through story and repetition. Elders would point to a hill and say, That's where the warning smoke came from when the buffalo turned east. Or from that ridge, we saw the smoke of our cousins returning. These places became part of communal memory signal stations, etched not in ink, but in narrative. They were sacred in a quiet, functional way, not because ceremonies were held there, but because communication had passed through them, carried by fire and wind. In a modern world filled with GPS, satellites, and fixed signal towers, it's easy to forget how deeply place used to matter in communication. But for Native American tribes using smoke signals, the landscape was the message board. Every tree line, hilltop, and ravine had a part to play. Signalers weren't just lighting fires, they were composing messages in harmony with their environment, adjusting every detail to match the rhythms of wind, elevation, and sightline. The result was a form of communication that was intimate, grounded, and breathtakingly attuned to the world it came from. In the next chapter, we'll move from geography to meaning. Now that we understand where the signals rose and how they were shaped, we'll begin to explore what they said, the codes, the messages, the vocabulary of fire. A language crafted not with sound, but with silence and smoke. Though smoke signals might seem simple at first, just bursts of smoke against the sky, the truth is that they carried a quiet complexity. These messages were not shouted declarations, but coded whispers rising into the wind. They spoke in pattern and rhythm, in pause and puff, while the basic forms were often shared across tribal lines. 1 puff, 2 puffs, 3 in rapid succession. The deeper meanings were shaped by custom, context, and sometimes secrecy. In this chapter, we explore the hidden vocabulary behind the smoke, the codes, the cues, and the invisible agreements that turned simple fires into lifelines. Many smoke signals operated within an agreed-upon framework. Just as travelers today use red lights to stop and green lights to go, so too did different tribes rely on a shared visual shorthand. For instance, among several plains tribes, a single puff might mean everything is fine. It was a check-in, no cause for alarm. 2 puffs could suggest movement. We are on our way, or the group has left. 3 puffs, as we've seen before, often indicated trouble, an immediate warning, a threat, or a call for help. These foundational signals were usually prearranged, agreed upon, before hunting parties split up or scouts were sent ahead. But communication rarely stays simple. Life is messy, and the messages needed to reflect that. So tribes built on those basic patterns, with modifiers, timing, spacing, repetition. A series of short, closely spaced puffs might signal that danger was near and urgent. The same 3 puffs, spread out slowly with long pauses, could suggest that the danger was distant but real. In some cases, the signal would be repeated at regular intervals to hold attention. We're still here, still watching, still in need. The code was both fixed and fluid, allowing signalers to improvise while staying within recognizable bounds. In some regions, directional signals were used, a single puff followed by a directional actions, such as an arm raised, a blanket waved, or a visible movement, could point toward a specific area. In areas where multiple signal fires were active, this helped prevent confusion. It was especially useful when coordinating travel or tracking game. Imagine 3 hunting parties scattered across a plain. One might send a smoke puff followed by a series of directional signals to indicate where buffalo had been seen. The others could respond with their own puffs, confirmation, question, or a new location. It was coordination across distance without a single word spoken. More elaborate codes emerged in times of war. In these moments, speed and clarity became vital. Some tribes developed specific patterns to indicate troop movements, enemy numbers, or ambush sites. For example, 2 short puffs followed by 1 long stream might mean enemy seen to the north. 3 short puffs, repeated twice, could signal an urgent retreat. These codes were tightly guarded, shared only among trusted warriors and signalers. A wrong puffer, a misread signal could cost lives. Precision, timing, and trust were everything. The battlefield might be miles away, but smoke connected the front lines to those at home. In certain communities, spiritual meanings were woven into the codes. A single spiral puff, difficult to produce, but stunning when successful, could signify a ceremonial event. It might mean a birth had occurred, or that a sacred dance was beginning. This wasn't just information, it was invitation. Neighboring villages, seeing such a signal, might prepare to send gifts, visitors, or blessings. In this way, smoke linked not only warriors and scouts, but families, clans, and spiritual circles. A curl of smoke could be both message and prayer, both announcement and offering. Smoke signaling could also incorporate deception. In times of danger, a tribe might deliberately send false signals to mislead an enemy or mask their movements. This required not only knowledge of one's own codes, but an understanding of how others might interpret them. In some cases, tribes would light decoy fires at a distance to create confusion, smoke rising in one direction, while the real movement occurred in another. These acts of strategic misdirection required confidence and subtlety, and the success of such ploys became the stuff of oral history, passed down like stories of clever warriors and silent victories. The secrecy of the codes made them deeply personal to each tribe. Outsiders, whether rival tribes or foreign explorers, might see the smoke, but without knowledge of the patterns, the message was unreadable. Even within tribes, some signals were considered sacred knowledge, taught only to a select few. Elders, war chiefs, or designated messengers might guard these codes, sharing them only when needed. The result was a communication system that was not just practical, but protective. It allowed tribes to speak across distance without revealing their intentions to those who would do them harm. Yet even with all this structure, smoke signals always left space for human touch. A seasoned signaler might alter the rhythm of a message to express urgency or sorrow. A longer pause, a slightly higher puff, a slower repetition, these nuances conveyed emotion, much like a speaker's tone or a singer's phrasing. It wasn't just about what the signal said, it was about how it was said. A signal wasn't just a code, it was a presence, a voice in the distance saying, "I'm here, I see you, listen." In modern times, these codes are largely lost to history, surviving only in fragments recorded in the journals of explorers, preserved in tribal memory, or reconstructed by scholars. But their essence remains powerful. They remind us that language doesn't have to be spoken, that communication doesn't require wires or screens. A puff of smoke in the right place at the right moment could carry more weight than 1,000 words. It could warn, welcome, deceive, or bless. It could cross valleys, connect hearts, and write messages on the sky. And so the codes of the smoke endure, not in use, but in memory, an ancient alphabet without letters, carried not on ink or parchment, but on the breath of the wind. While smoke signals served many practical purposes, warning, coordination, communication, they were also deeply embedded in the ceremonial life of Native American tribes. Fire itself was sacred, and smoke was seen as more than a toolet, was a spirit, a messenger, a bridge between worlds. In this chapter, we turn our attention to the rituals and ceremonies where smoke played not just a communicative role, but a spiritual one. For many native peoples, sending a smoke signal was as much an offering as it was a messaging act of reverence and connection to the divine. Among several tribes, the fire used for signaling was never treated as an ordinary blaze. It was built with intention, often preceded by quiet prayers or songs. Before a single branch was laid, the fire tender might offer a pinch of tobacco or cornmeal to the earth, thanking the spirits for the tools of fire and air. These offerings were not superstitions, they were acknowledgments of balance, respect, and gratitude. The act of summoning smoke was spiritual at its core, a way of asking permission to speak through the elements. Some smoke signals were sent not to people at all, but to spirits, ancestors, or sky beings. During times of drought, for instance, smoke might be used in ceremonies to call upon rain spirits. In mourning, rising smoke could serve as a symbolic guide, helping a loved one's soul ascend to the spirit world. It was not uncommon for tribes to send ritual smoke messages at the start of a new season or to mark the first hunt of the year. These signals weren't about practical information. They were about intention, ritual, rhythm, and sacred acknowledgement. In certain cultures, smoke was believed to carry thoughts. A prayer whispered into the fire would rise with the smoke and be heard by those beyond the veil of this world. Signal fires lit during ceremonies might rise for hours, sending no code but radiating meaning all the same. To those who understood, the presence of that smoke on the horizon wasn't merely atmospheric, it was a message of unity, remembrance, or shared celebration. A village 5 miles away might see that pale plume curling into the evening sky and know the ceremony has begun. There were also rites where specific smoke signals initiated communal events. For example, among some plains tribes, a distinct series of puffs sent at dawn might signal the beginning of a sun dance or seasonal feast. Villagers from across the region would gather in response, knowing that the sacred fire had spoken. These gatherings reinforced community bonds and honored tradition, with the smoke acting as the opening invocation. In this way, the signal fire was more than functional, it was ceremonial architecture, marking sacred time and space. In healing practices, too, smoke had a place. Medicine people often used herbs such as sage, sweetgrass, or cedar to create ceremonial smoke, not meant to be seen from afar, but to envelop the space, cleanse the body, and prepare the soul. But sometimes, healing rituals were announced with a single signal, a call for the healer to come, or a sign that the rite had begun. For those watching from a distance, that single breath of smoke was enough to quiet the heart and open the spirit to the healing taking place elsewhere. The color, texture, and behavior of smoke were all interpreted symbolically during these rites. Thick, rising smoke meant the message was strong and accepted. Thin or quickly dispersing smoke might suggest the need to wait, reflect, or try again. Observers sometimes noted the direction the smoke leaned, reading the wind not just for weather, but for omen. Did the smoke drift east, toward the dawn, toward beginnings, or west, toward dusk, closure, and endings? These subtleties turned the sky into a sacred text, each plume a line of divine poetry. During intertribal gatherings or peace talks, ceremonial smoke signals served as invitations and guarantees of safe passage. A long, unbroken column might be lit to welcome a delegation or to signify that a neutral meeting ground had been prepared. These signals were public declarations of goodwill and trust, visible signs of intention and openness. In a world where misunderstandings could quickly turn to conflict, such signals were powerful tools of diplomacy, smoke rising not just to announce, but to reassure. Even in personal rites of passage, coming vogue ceremonies, or marriage rituals, smoke sometimes played a quiet role. A father might light a small signal fire at the edge of the village to honor his child's first successful hunt. A grandmother might send a short puff into the morning sky to mark the day her granddaughter became a woman. These were not grand spectacles, but soft acknowledgments carried upward like whispers into the dawn. In the moment, the message might seem fleeting, but to those who watched, it meant everything. As we step back from the rituals of smoke, we begin to see that what was once thought of as just signaling was, in many cases, sacred ceremony, a language, yes, but also a prayer, a rhythm, a celebration. In these moments, smoke signals were not simply tools of communication, but instruments of connection to the divine, a language spoken not only between people, but between people and the sky, between earth and spirit, between this life and the next. A message carried on the wind, from heart to horizon. Smoke signals were not only tools of peace and ritual, they were instruments of strategy, urgency, and survival. In times of war, when the cost of miscommunication could be deadly, the ability to send swift, silent messages across long distances was invaluable. Native American tribes adapted their smoke signaling methods to meet the demands of conflict, refining them into a battle-tested form of military communication. In this chapter, we explore how the same soft plumes that once called communities together were also used to protect them, to rally warriors, to track enemies, and to shift the course of confrontation without a word being spoken. The nature of pre-colonial warfare varied widely between tribes. Some conflicts were small and swift raids, skirmishes, or acts of retaliation. Others were prolonged and deliberate, involving days of maneuvering and tracking. In every case, speed and coordination were critical. Unlike modern armies, which rely on centralized command structures and advanced technology, Native American war parties often split into smaller, agile groups. These groups needed a way to stay connected while moving through vast and sometimes treacherous terrain. Smoke provided that connection. Before a war party even departed, smoke signals might be used to send advance notice to allied villages. A single puff at a specific time might confirm that a group was on the move. A sequence of puffs could signal the chosen path or rendezvous point. These prearranged messages allowed scattered communities to prepare securing provisions, evacuating vulnerable members, or sending scouts to monitor known travel routes. In these early moments of engagement, smoke was not an afterthought, it was the opening move. During campaigns, signalers played an essential role in maintaining battlefield awareness. Positioned on high ground, they served as lookouts and communicators, relaying the movements of enemy forces and coordinating tribal responses. If a scout spotted an opposing war party, the signaler could immediately light a fire and send a series of puffs skyward. Depending on the code used, the smoke might say, "Enemy seen to the north," or "Prepare for attack." From miles away, warriors could see the signal and respond: regroup, hide, advance, or retreat. Secrecy was paramount. In wartime, smoke signaling took on a second layer of complexity. the need to be understood by allies, but unreadable to enemies. Some tribes developed specific battle codes known only to a select few. These codes might change with each campaign to prevent interception. A signal that once meant danger might, in a different context, mean victory or diversion. This constant variation kept adversaries guessing and made smoke signaling a psychological tool as well as a logistical one. It was a chess match in the sky, each puff a calculated move. Smoke also allowed for misdirection, a tactic employed with great sophistication. A decoy party might be sent in one direction, lighting a signal to suggest that the main force was there. Meanwhile, the actual warriors advanced from another side, undetected. A false alarm signal might lure an enemy into revealing their position or stretching their defenses thin. Such strategies depended on discipline and coordination, on the precise timing of fire and signal across great distances. The smoke wasn't just warning or calling, it was bait, camouflage, and command. Even within a single tribe, different groups might use smoke for internal coordination. War leaders needed to know when scouts returned, when a path was blocked, when supplies were low. These updates could not wait for runners. A signal fire at dusk or dawn might confirm that a raid had succeeded or that captives had been freed. The smoke did not carry details, but it carried the truth of movement and intent, and it did so without delay. For a culture that prized agility and adaptation in warfare, this immediacy was a tremendous advantage. On rare occasions, smoke signals were used to propose truces or terms of surrender. A steady column, lit at a traditional meeting place, could signify a request for parley. The sight of such a signal was often met with caution, but not always with hostility. It meant someone wanted to speak. In times of prolonged conflict, such messages offered a glimmer of diplomacy. Smoke used not as a cry of battle, but as a tentative bridge to peace. Even in war, the wind could carry words of hope. There are oral histories that speak of legendary signalers, men and women, who could send perfect puffs at great speed, who understood the landscape so well that they could position their fires to be visible across multiple valleys. These individuals were not just firemakers, they were tactical experts. They knew how to read a battle from afar and how to shape the outcome with smoke alone. Their names may not appear in books, but in tribal memory they are honored as warriors of the wind fighters who never held a bow, but who nonetheless helped turn the tide. Of course, not every battle went as planned. There are stories, too, of missed signals, of smoke lost in mist or scattered by sudden gusts. In those moments, tribes learned painful lessons about the limits of even the best tools. But these moments also reinforced the importance of preparation, of shared code, and of knowing not just how to build a fire, but how to read the sky. The smoke could falter, but the will to communicate never did. As we close this chapter, we are reminded that smoke signals were not limited to ritual or routine. They were instruments of survival, shaped by necessity, sharpened by experience. In the stillness before battle, and in the silence after, the smoke carried more than instruction. It carried resolve, memory, and the will of a people to defend their land and each other. It was the language of warriors, spoken without sounds, swift, spare, and written on the breath of flame. Not all smoke rose in the name of war. Just as often, smoke signals served as a bridge between divided groups, a visual language of diplomacy, hospitality, and cautious alliance. In a world where spoken language varied from tribe to tribe, where misunderstandings could escalate into violence, and where distance posed constant challenges to communication, smoke became a neutral intermediary. It could be read without sound, understood from afar, and interpreted with a shared sense of ceremony. In this chapter, we explore how smoke signals helped prevent conflict, initiated dialogue, and maintained fragile networks of peace. Among many tribes, the sight of a solitary, slow-rising plume was understood not as a threat, but as an invitation. These signals were crafted with care and restraint. No erratic bursts, no urgent flares. They rose steadily, like breath or prayer, communicating a willingness to talk. Whether used to request a meeting, acknowledge a border, or honor an agreement, such smoke was a symbol of trust. It said, "We see you, we come in peace." And for centuries, it worked. Diplomatic smoke signals were often sent from traditional gathering sites, neutral spaces known to both parties, such as river crossings, mountain saddles, or ceremonial meadows. These locations held shared history. Perhaps past treaties had been forged there, or communal hunts held in seasons long past. Lighting a signal fire at such a site reinforced its meaning. Not just a call, but a remembrance. It told the other party that the past was known, the customs respected, the invitation sincere. Before major negotiations or peace councils, a signaler might spend hours selecting the site and timing of their message. The goal was not only to be seen, but to be interpreted correctly. A premature signal could lead to confusion. A fire too far from the traditional meeting ground might suggest bad faith. These subtleties required more than just technical skill. They demanded political awareness. Signalers in these moments acted as diplomats, balancing formality with flexibility, creating a language of tone and timing rather than sentence and word. There were established conventions, passed down like unwritten law. 2 slow puffs might signal the arrival of a peace delegation. A continuous ribbon of smoke could mean that a ceremony was about to begin and that all parties were welcome to approach unarmed. In some regions, smoke signals were used in tandem with songs, flutes, or drums' soft sounds drifting from the forest edge or the riverbank. These combined cues created a multi-sensory welcome, a clear indication that the approaching group came not for battle, but for dialogue. Among allies, smoke could reinforce bonds. During seasonal gatherings or intertribal feasts, tribes might send signals in advance to confirm attendance. These puffs were celebratory, joyful, steady, like beacons of shared purpose. "We are coming," they said. "We will bring stories and laughter and songs." In these contexts, smoke was less a tool and more a gesture, part of the ritual of connection that helped tribes navigate the complex tapestry of alliances, kinship, and seasonal cooperation. But smoke could also navigate the delicate space between neutrality and suspicion. When tribes with a history of conflict sought to avoid further bloodshed, smoke signals offered a non-invasive means of communication. A signal from a disputed border might convey, "We are passing through, not invading." Another might announce, "We seek no quarrel, we travel only with families." In these tense moments, words could fail, but a steady column of smoke, well-timed and well-placed, could soothe anxieties better than any envoy. There are also stories of smoke being used to mend broken trust. After a betrayal or a violent misunderstanding, one tribe might send a slow, deliberate signal at dawn, just 1 puff, no more. It was a message of humility, a quiet admission of wrong, or a plea for reconsideration. The responding tribe, if they chose, might reply in kind or not at all. In this exchange, the silence itself became part of the language. It was negotiation without voice, apology without speech. In some cases, smoke signals initiated shared rituals of reconciliation. A signal seen and answered might lead to a day of fasts, or the lighting of council fires, or the weaving of peace belts. The smoke was the first gesture, the open door. It could not resolve every dispute, but it could begin the conversation. And sometimes, beginning was the hardest part. As European settlers arrived and territorial boundaries shifted, smoke diplomacy took on new urgency. Tribes used signals to communicate with each other across increasingly restricted lands. Messages of warning, of safe travel routes, of impending meetings. These became lifelines in a world growing more fragmented. Even as new technologies emerged, the old language of fire and sky remained trusted. It was immediate, it was visible, and it belonged to no one but the people who had always known how to read it. Smoke signals remind us that diplomacy does not require grandeur. Sometimes, all it takes is a single gesture, rising calmly against the sky. A puff of smoke, shaped with care, seen by another, interpreted with hope. In such moments, peace was not declared with speeches or signatures. It was suggested, hinted, invited. And when both sides answered, the air between them cleared, and for a time, even old enemies became neighbors once again. In the world of smoke signals, the act of sending a message was never casual. It was deliberate, practiced, and deeply respected. Not just anyone could light the fire and call out across the sky. This responsibility fell to a select few. They were the watchers, the fire tenders, the wind readers. They were entrusted with messages, not just of urgency, but of meaning. In this chapter, we turn our attention to those individuals who served as the keepers of the fire, the skilled signalers who stood between silence and connection, between isolation and community. Signalers had to possess a rare combination of skills. They needed physical dexterity to control the fire with speed and accuracy. They needed sharp eyes to spot distant plumes on the horizon, often in shifting weather or failing light. They had to know their surroundings, intimately where to build a fire, how the wind behaved on each ridge, which spots offered the clearest view. But they also had to carry mental discipline. A signaler couldn't panic. Messages had to be sent precisely, no matter the emotion behind them. In that way, they were like dancers, like drummers focused entirely on rhythm and timing, each movement meaningful. In some cultures, signalers were chosen from among those who excelled in hunting or tracking. These were people already attuned to the landscape, sensitive to movement, skilled at blending with nature. Others came from families with a tradition of signaling, passing knowledge down like an heirloom. A signaler's tools, a carved fan, a favorite hide, a bundle of smoke-rich herbs might be passed from parent to child, imbued with history and reverence. These weren't mere accessories. They were instruments of a living language. Trust was everything. A signaler's role placed them at the heart of tribal communication. They knew the codes, the emergency signals, the ceremonial timings. They might be the first to see danger, the only one with the means to warn others. In that sense, they were like the pulse of the village, monitoring the wider world and translating it into a single, clear call. And because smoke signals were so visible, a signaler also bore responsibility for what others might interpret. A mistake could bring confusion, or worse, misplaced fear. So only the trusted few were given that power. The work could be lonely, A signaler might spend hours, or even days, posted on a ridge or outcrop, waiting, watching, keeping the fire ready. In fair weather or storm, they remained, tending embers, scanning the sky, always alert. This solitude was part of the jawbone unspoken pact between the signaler and their people. They stood apart so that others could stay connected. They gave up comfort so others might have safety. In this way, they resembled sentinels or guardians, part of the community, yet set slightly apart from it. Ceremony surrounded their role, even in simple ways. Before lighting a signal fire, a keeper might speak a prayer to the wind, or sprinkle herbs on the ground as an offering. They might tie a feather to the handle of their fan, symbolizing the message they hoped to send. Some tribes held annual blessings for their signalers, recognizing the importance of their vigilance. These were not loud rituals, but quiet affirmations, gentle reminders that to tend fire was to tend the thread of connection itself. Among allies, signalers sometimes met in person to update each other on codes or to share techniques. These gatherings were rare but treasured opportunities to exchange stories, to test new methods, to learn from distant cousins who worked with different trees, different winds, different skies. These moments reinforced a kind of unspoken kinship among those who practiced the same craft, even if they had never seen each other's fires. Elders often remembered great signalers from their youth, the one who warned the village just in time, or the one whose perfectly timed message summoned help in a blizzard. These stories kept the role alive in communal memory, honoring those who had once sent signals into the sky with quiet resolve. Some were remembered by name, others simply by the ridge where they stood. That's where the woman with the fast hands worked, an elder might say, pointing to a hill, her smoke long gone, but her presence still rising in the stories. As technology and settlement began to transform the land, many signalers saw their role diminish. New methods of communication arrived: paper, post, wires, eventually machines that could shout farther and faster than smoke ever could. But those who had once tended the fire never forgot its lessons. They carried its rhythm in their bodies, its silence in their breath. And some, even in old age, would still turn to the wind when it shifted, as if expecting a message on the horizon. The keepers of the fire remind us that communication has always required more than tools. It requires intention, care, presence. In their hands, smoke was not just a message, it was memory, duty, connection. They shaped the sky with breath and flame, and in doing so, kept their people woven together across valleys, across danger, across time itself. As long as humans have lived in complex societies, they have innovated not just in how they build their homes or hunt their food, but in how they connect with one another. Communication is more than the exchange of facts. It's the means by which culture travels. Memory is preserved, and coordination becomes possible across space and time. Smoke signaling, though often imagined as a primitive or static system, was anything but stagnant. Across the North American continent, native tribes adapted and refined their use of smoke in remarkably innovative ways. This chapter explores the subtle evolutions and improvements made to smoke communication, how creativity and necessity shaped one of the oldest forms of long-distance messaging into something nuanced, reliable, and responsive to the changing world around it. To begin with, the very materials used in smoke signaling were constantly tested and adjusted depending on availability, climate, and desired signal characteristics. While many tribes used damp green brush or pine needles to create thick, white smoke, others experimented with different organic materials to alter the smoke's density, color, and longevity. Some groups in the Great Basin, for example, discovered that certain roots or plant fibers produced a darker, more visible smoke when burned slowly. Others found that adding powdered minerals or dried herbs to the fire could tint the smoke slightly, a technique that, though not widespread, introduced another layer of meaning to specific signals. These adjustments weren't just for visual effect. They were practical decisions rooted in trial, error, and an ever-deepening knowledge of the natural world. Some innovations focused on the construction and control of the fire itself. Signal fires needed to be stable, consistent, and capable of producing smoke on demand. For this, tribes developed clever ways to manage airflow and fuel. In forested regions, signalers would dig shallow pits in the earth to insulate the fire and protect it from wind, then build up a frame of stones around it to control the oxygen flow. In more open, wind-exposed environments, like the plains or desert mesas, tribes might construct windbreaks or fire shields using stones, brush, or hides. These structures weren't just functional, they were often portable, allowing a traveling war party or hunting group to set up a signal post quickly wherever they stopped. More complex innovations emerged in how smoke was released and timed. One of the most fascinating techniques was the use of prearranged chambers or smoke traps, small, tent-like enclosures built over the fire, where smoke could collect and be released all at once. By quickly removing a covering flap or lifting a panel, the signaler could produce a strong, sudden puff that was clearly distinguishable from a natural fire. These enclosures also allowed for repeated pulses without needing to rebuild the fire or add fresh fuel. In some cases, signalers created a kind of rhythmic bellows effect by manipulating the flap with timed motions, creating even spaced-out bursts that mimicked drum beats, an innovation that echoed the layered communication of oral storytelling. Innovation also extended to the strategic placement of signaling posts. Over time, tribes mapped out specific high points in their territory, known for clear lines of sight. These locations formed the basis of early communication networks, with signalers stationed across ranges of hills or valleys, relaying messages from one post to the next. In effect, this created long-distance smoke corridors. One signal could travel over 100 miles in a matter of minutes as it passed from ridge to ridge, much like a baton in a relay race. To make this possible, some tribes standardized certain codes and ensured that signalers trained in the same methods were posted at each node. This decentralized system functioned much like a telegraph line centuries before such devices existed, with each signaler serving as both transmitter and interpreter. Even the format of messages evolved. Tribes didn't rely solely on simple numeric codes: 1 puff, 2 puffs, and so on. In some cases, signalers developed entire routines or sequences to convey more complex instructions. A smoke burst might be followed by a pause, then another pair of bursts, then a longer trail of continuous smoke. These sequences, when memorized and practiced, allowed for messages that included not only basic information, but context, nuance, and urgency. For instance, a tribe might use a specific rhythm of bursts to indicate whether the enemy was moving quickly or slowly, whether they were armed or carrying trade goods. The smoke, in effect, became a kind of musical language, one based not in notes but in time and shape. This musicality was not accidental. Many native cultures place deep emphasis on rhythm not only in music and dance, but in ritual and speech. Signalers, often trained from a young age, were taught to move in time with their breath or heartbeat when releasing smoke. This created a natural cadence that made their signals easier to interpret from a distance. Just as drummers keep a beat that can be followed by dancers, signalers used their internal rhythms to structure messages that were both expressive and predictable. This practice also had a calming effect on the signaler, keeping their focus sharp and their movements deliberate, even in times of stress or danger. Visual framing also became more refined over time. Signalers realized that a rising puff of smoke could appear larger or smaller, depending on what was behind its sky, trees, rock, or snow. They began to build signal fires at locations where the background provided the clearest contrast. A white puff against a dark pine forest was more visible than one against a cloudy sky. In snowy terrain, darker smoke was preferred. In arid regions, cliffs or stone backdrops were sought for better visibility. These visual decisions weren't just about clarity. They were about artistry. Signalers weren't merely technicians. They were composers, orchestrating fire, air, light, and shadow to tell a story that would last only moments but reach for miles. Another lesser-known innovation involved collaboration between different communication methods. In coastal or riverine areas, smoke signals were often accompanied by reflective signal sunlight, flashed off polished surfaces, or bright cloths, a practice similar to later helograph systems. At night, small, carefully shaded flame beacons were used, mimicking the timing of smoke puffs, but adapted for low-light conditions. In particularly advanced systems, drummers or hornblowers were positioned close to signalers so that a smoke puff might be echoed by a sound, confirming its meaning. This blending of techniques allowed for cross-verification if a smoke signal was misread or distorted by wind. The accompanying sound could clarify the message. One must also consider the evolution of the roles surrounding signalers. As smoke communication became more sophisticated, it required coordination, not just from those making the signals, but from those watching, relaying, and interpreting them. Entire teams were sometimes involved, one person managing the fire, another timing the signal release, others stationed along distant ridgelines, watching for return messages. During extended journeys or wartime operations, signalers often traveled with assistants who gathered fuel, scouted the next signal post, or kept watch for enemy spies who might mimic or intercept signals. In some cultures, young apprentices were paired with older signalers, learning not just how to build fires, but how to read the world through movement, wind, and change. These innovations did not arise in a vacuum. They were born from need, from creativity, and from a culture that saw communication not as a mechanical function, but as a sacred thread binding people together. As environments shifted and challenges grew, Native American tribes did not abandon the smoke. They enriched it. They asked more of it, and it responded. With each improvement, each subtle refinement, smoke signaling evolved from a basic tool into a complex system of symbolic exchange responsive to both the terrain and the hearts of those who used it. It is tempting to see all ancient technologies as static, fixed, unchanging relics of a distant past. But the innovations in smoke communication tell another story, one of refinement without written blueprints, of experimentation without laboratories, of human ingenuity woven directly into the sky. As we look ahead to the next chapters, we'll begin to see how these systems, so carefully developed, were also vulnerable to interruption. misunderstanding, and even deliberate misuse. But here, at the peak of their development, we honor the brilliance of the signalers and their traditions. In a time before wires and waves, they wrote in smoke, and though their messages vanished in the wind, the ingenuity behind them still lingers, curling upward through memory, like a signal that refuses to fade. Even the most carefully designed systems can fail. In the delicate world of smoke communication, where every puff carried meaning and timing was everything, the potential for misunderstanding was ever present. A misplaced pause, an ill-timed signal, or an unexpected gust of wind could alter a message in subtle yet disastrous ways. And when that message was one of danger or diplomacy, even a small error could unravel days of planning or cost lives. In this chapter, we explore the vulnerabilities of smoke signaling, how messages went awry, how signals were misread, and what was done to mitigate these ever-present risks. The first and most obvious source of confusion came from the elements. Smoke, for all its visibility, is ephemeral and at the mercy of weather. Wind was both ally and adversary. A gentle breeze could carry a signal far, but a sudden gust could twist it into nothing. A strong wind might scatter a puff before it had time to rise, or push the smoke sideways so that it blended with the background and vanished. Experienced signalers learned to read the wind, testing it with feathers, bits of grass, or the simple lift of a hand. But even they were not immune to rapid changes. A message that began as 3 clear bursts might dissolve midstream, leaving the distant observer to wonder, was that 2 puffs, or 4, or just 1 broken apart? Visibility added another layer of uncertainty. Clouds, fog, and even the angle of the sun could obscure a signal. In forested areas, trees might block or fragment the smoke column. In snowy terrain, white smoke could blend into the backdrop. A clear morning might give way to haze by midday, and in the distance, smoke could appear smaller, thinner, or more erratic than it really was. Observers had to judge carefully, interpreting not only the pattern but the context. Was a storm coming? Was this a routine message or something urgent? This required not only eyesight but intuition. Then there were the human errors, those born of fatigue, distraction, or inexperience. A signaler might mistime a cover flap, releasing smoke too early or too late. They might miscount the puffs or forget the correct sequence in a moment of panic. In some cases, 2 fires might be sending messages at once, creating overlapping columns that confused the intended meanings. This was particularly dangerous in times of conflict. A message meant to warn of an approaching enemy could be read as a friendly check-in, leading to complacency. A simple mistake, a signal sent from the wrong ridge, for instance, could cause a scouting party to head in the wrong direction, missing their rendezvous or walking straight into danger. Miscommunication also occurred across tribal boundaries. While many tribes shared similar signal forms, such as the 3-puff warning, others used completely different codes. A column that meant safe passage to one tribe might signify enemy territory to another. In areas with frequent interaction between groups, signalers were often trained in multiple codes or kept up to date through gatherings and shared ceremonies. But in borderlands or among tribes with less friendly relations, misinterpretation was a constant risk. Some of the most tragic conflicts in oral history began with a signal misread, an invitation mistaken for an insult, a warning mistaken for a threat. There were also risks of mimicry and deception. Just as tribes used smoke to communicate truthfully, some learned to use it to deceive. An enemy might light a fire and imitate the signal of an ally, luring a group into a trap. Or they might send a false warning to disperse or distract a village, while an attack came from the opposite direction. These tactics required a deep knowledge of the target's signal codes and behaviors, but in long-standing rivalries, such knowledge was sometimes gained through observation or betrayal. As a result, many tribes kept their most important signal codes secret, known only to a handful of trusted individuals. This secrecy protected against infiltration, but made succession difficult. If a signaler died unexpectedly, their unique knowledge might be lost forever. To guard against these dangers, some tribes developed systems of double confirmation. A smoke signal might be followed by a ground sign, such as an arrow laid across a trail, or by a bird call repeated at a known interval. Others relied on visual confirmations, sending a scout to observe the signal fire's position before acting on its message. In times of great uncertainty, tribes sometimes waited for a second, confirming signal before responding. This added delay could be costly, but it reduced the chance of a fatal misunderstanding. It was a compromise between speed and safety, trust and caution. Even among skilled signalers, there were moments of doubt. A puff appeared on the horizon, but was it a signal or just a cooking fire? Was the rhythm meaningful or a coincidence? Observers learned to look for context clues, the time of day, the presence of known camps, the direction of the wind. But sometimes there was no clarity. In those moments, the uncertainty itself became part of the message. A tribe might tighten defenses, delay a decision, or send a scout to investigate. The smoke had spoken, but what it had said was unclear, and so they waited. Over time, oral histories collected these moments. Elders told of the time a storm broke a message mid-signal, leading to confusion and a missed opportunity for peace. Or the story of a young signaler, new to his role, who panicked and sent the wrong codon error that nearly cost his village its safety. These tales were not told to shame, but to teach. They reminded listeners that even in a system built on breath and rhythm, there was always room for error and room, too, for forgiveness and adaptation. Despite the risks, tribes never abandoned the practice. They refined it. They learned to cross-check, to teach more carefully, to listen with more than their eyes. Smoke signaling endured not because it was perfect, but because it worked well enough, and it connected people in a world where silence was often the only alternative. Its fragility did not make it weak. It made it human. Like speech, it could falter. Like relationships, it required trust. And like all the best things, it asked not for certainty, but for faith. Smoke messages were fleeting, fragile, and sometimes wrong. But for those who watched the horizon, they were still worth reading. They were the heartbeat of a people stretched across distance and time. And even when the wind scattered them or the signals went unreturned, the smoke still rose an offering, a question, a hope written in sky. As European explorers, settlers, and missionaries began to cross the vast North American continent, they encountered a world already connected through paths etched into the land, through oral histories passed from mouth to mouth, and through smoke signals rising into the open air. These newcomers, arriving with their own systems of letters, bells, flags, and printed maps, often misunderstood what they were seeing. To many Europeans, the sight of smoke rising in measured puffs from a hilltop was either dismissed as coincidence or feared as some mystic ritual. But as contact deepened and curiosity turned into observation, they began to realize that they were witnessing a complex and effective system of communication. In this chapter, we explore the impressions, reactions, and misunderstandings Europeans had when encountering Native American smoke signaling and how these interactions reshaped the use of that ancient language. One of the earliest written accounts of smoke signaling in North America comes from Spanish explorers moving through the Southwest. In their journals, they noted with suspicion how messages seemed to pass between distant villages without a single horse or messenger in sight. A plume would rise in the morning, and by mid-afternoon, a neighboring village had already taken action, arming themselves, hiding their valuables, or moving toward a meeting point. The Spaniards, puzzled, described this phenomenon with terms like witchcraft or sorcery. They could not yet understand that what they were witnessing was informations received and acted upon, a system more ancient and more agile than their own. French missionaries in the Northeast were among the first to recognize smoke signaling as a form of structured communication. Living for months or years within Algonquin and Huron communities, they observed how smoke was used not only for defense but for daily coordination. The Jesuits, ever meticulous, began to write down the patterns they witnessed: puffs in threes, long trails of gray against morning skies, bursts repeated at twilight. Some even tried to interpret them, though often with little success. The codes remained elusive, protected not just by complexity, but by culture. Smoke signals were not merely visual symbols, they were contextual, tied to landscape, season, and shared knowledge. To decipher them without understanding the culture was like trying to understand music by staring at the notes without hearing the melody. The British, with their military traditions and fascination with systems, took a different approach. During colonial campaigns, and later during the American Revolution, British officers observed how tribes allied with or against them used smoke for rapid mobilization. In some cases, they attempted to replicate it. There are records of British and colonial troops building smoke fires to signal scouts or coordinate troop movement, but their versions lacked the nuance and effectiveness of the indigenous systems. Without the cultural immersion, their signals were often too simplistic, too rigid. It was like copying the gestures of a dance without knowing the rhythm. Still, the attempt reveals an acknowledgement. These signals worked, and they worked well enough to be worth imitating. European settlers, particularly those moving westward during the 18th and 19th centuries, developed an uneasy relationship with smoke signaling. On one hand, they were amazed by it, a marvel of primitive ingenuity, they often said. On the other hand, they feared it. To see a plume of smoke rising in the distance became, for many, a source of anxiety. Was it a warning, a call to arms, a sign that their presence had been noticed? In settler diaries and letters, smoke is often described with a sense of dread. "Smoke on the ridge," one might write, "we shall sleep lightly tonight." In these instances, the smoke was not a message, but a mirror revealing the settlers' fear and ignorance of the land's deeper rhythms. As treaties were broken and conflicts escalated into war, smoke signals took on new meaning, both as tools of resistance and as symbols of sovereignty. During the forced relocations of the 19th century, including the tragic Trail of Tears, some tribes used smoke to maintain contact between scattered family groups. A signal seen on the horizon might be the only word a person received from a brother or cousin for months. In these moments, the smoke was not merely practical, it was emotional, a wordless reassurance that someone was still out there, still alive, still remembering. Yet, European encroachment also changed the practice. In areas under heavy surveillance, signaling had to become more discreet. Fires were built in valleys or behind hills, their smoke funneled through cracks in rocks or trees to avoid detection. Some tribes began using coded combinations of day and night signals, smoke and firelight, to add another layer of ambiguity. The act of signaling became an act of resistance, a way to retain autonomy over one's movement, knowledge, and relationships, even in the face of growing pressure to assimilate or disappear. At the same time, romanticized ideas of native smoke signaling began to appear in European literature and popular media. Paintings, dime novels, and stage plays depicted stoic figures silhouetted against the sky, puffing messages of defiance or love into the air. These depictions were often inaccurate, traducing a rich and diverse tradition into a simplistic trope. In the imagination of the West, the smoke signal became both a curiosity and it lost its specificity, its cultural weight. It was turned into entertainment. Yet beneath these distortions, the real practice continued in forests, along rivers, and atop windswept ridges. Some Europeans, especially those who had lived closely with native communities, became defenders of the practice. They argued, in essays and speeches, that smoke signaling was not a backward relic, but a marvel of adaptation and design. A few even proposed incorporating it into broader communication systems, particularly in regions where telegraphs and roads had yet to reach. But these ideas were rarely taken seriously, and as settler expansion continued, the space for such practices shrank. Fire towers replaced lookout rocks, telegraph poles marched across the land, and the smoke began to fade, not because it had failed, but because the people who used it were being pushed to the edges. Still, some moments of cross-cultural exchange remain. There are accounts of frontier scouts, many of whom were native or of mixed ancestry, teaching settlers the basics of signaling. In remote areas, smoke messages were exchanged between indigenous guides and non-native trappers, ranchers, and military units. These interactions were often born of necessity, when horses failed, when terrain was too rough, when silence was required. And though brief, they served as small acts of mutual recognition, a silent code shared between strangers, acknowledging a common need. In time, as native tribes were pushed onto reservations and their movement restricted, smoke signaling declined. In some areas, it vanished altogether, but the memory of it remained woven into stories, preserved in ceremony, hidden in the landscape. Elders continued to tell of the days when messages rose into the sky like prayers, when a whole village could move as one, guided by nothing more than curls of smoke and the wisdom of those who tended the flame. In the wake of colonization, much was lost, but the encounter between European systems of communication and native smoke signaling reveals a deeper truth, that every culture, no matter its tools or tongue, seeks to connect, that every people finds ways to make their thoughts fly across mountains, across silence, across time. And though the Europeans arrived with pens and presses, with wires and flags, they could never fully understand the grace of a single puff of smoke, rising at dusk, soft, brief, and full of meaning. A message written not in ink, but in air. When we picture smoke signals, we often imagine dramatic scenes, warnings of danger, calls to arms, grand ceremonial messages rising from ridgelines. But most smoke signals were not extraordinary. They were ordinary. They were woven into the fabric of everyday life, used not to announce emergencies, but to maintain the slow and steady rhythm of community. From hunting trips to social visits, from weather alerts to shared meals, smoke was a way to stay connected across space without rushing across the landscape. In this chapter, we descend from the dramatic and return to the quiet, where smoke served as a gentle thread tying together the movements of daily life. One of the most common uses of smoke signals was simple check-ins. When a small hunting party ventured into the forest, they would often build a low, smoke-rich fire once they had reached their destination. A single puff steady and slow would rise to tell those back home that the party had arrived safely. It was a message that required no response, no follow-up, just the reassurance that someone had seen, someone had understood. Families watching the horizon would smile when they saw the signal. No words were exchanged, but peace had been delivered. In large territories with dispersed camps, smoke signals acted as a kind of social calendar. A series of short puffs might signal that a community feast was being prepared. Those who saw it knew to gather food, dress for travel, and begin making their way toward the host village. In some tribes, a smoke signal at dawn could mark the beginning of a trade day, where neighboring groups would meet at a known neutral ground to exchange goods, news, and stories. These messages were as clear as ringing bells or written invitations, understood by all who shared the code, carried not by paper but by air. Weather was another common topic of smoke signaling. For tribes whose activities depended on the patterns of the sky, sharing early signs of change was critical. If a signaler saw storm clouds gathering on the horizon, they might send a specific pattern of puffs perhaps to short bursts, followed by a long one to warn others. Villages downwind could use that information to secure food, cover belongings, and shelter animals. In a time before forecasts, these signals served as real-time alerts drawn directly from the land, interpreted by those who had studied wind and sky their whole lives. Courtship and family visits were sometimes arranged through smoke as well. While not all tribes used signals in this way, some stories tell of young men sending a brief puff to the edge of a neighboring village, wordless request to visit or to speak with a potential bride. If the family was open to the visit, they might send a gentle puff in return. If not, the sky remained silent. It was a respectful way to approach with dignity, to inquire without pressure. For families separated by distant siblings, cousins, elders, smoke signals allowed brief reconnection. "I am here," the smoke said. "I am thinking of you." In times of illness or birth, smoke offered a way to call for help or celebration. A woman going into labor might have her family send a specific signal toward the village medicine person, summoning them without causing alarm. If the birth went well, a single column of white smoke would be released at dusk, telling all nearby that a new life had arrived. In this way, the milestones of life were marked not only by firelight and song, but by a quiet gesture into the sky seen by those who cared, understood without explanation. Children learned these meanings early. They would mimic signalers in play, building small fires and waving their hands to form pretend messages. Elders would watch, correcting a rhythm here or explaining a code there. In this way, the knowledge passed on gently through imitation and patience. By the time a child became old enough to travel alone or join a hunting party, they knew the patterns by heart. They didn't need to be taught formally. They had seen them every day, rising above the trees, folded into the rhythm of their lives. Seasonal routines often began and ended with smoke. At the end of a harvest, A signal might be sent to nearby communities to mark the closing of the season. During winter hunts, when travel was difficult, signals confirmed arrivals and departures, or requested assistance if a party was delayed. Springtime brought its own vocabulary of smoke welcoming visitors, marking the return of migratory animals, or calling the community to prepare for planting. In this sense, smoke was not just a tool, it was a clock, a calendar, a form of collective memory. Even in moments of solitude, smoke carried meaning. A lone traveler, camping overnight in a remote part of the territory, might light a small signal fire, not to send a message, but to remind others they were not lost. To see smoke rising from a distant ridge was to know that someone was near, that someone still moved across the land, that the world, though vast, was not empty. These quiet reassurances mattered. They spoke of belonging, of shared presence, of a world watched over by many eyes. In today's fast-paced world, where communication is constant and often overwhelming, it's easy to forget the grace of messages that say only what is needed. Smoke signals were never used for idle chatter. They did not carry gossip, argument, or distraction. They carried presence. They said what needed to be said, no more, no less. And in doing so, they reminded their watchers to pause, to listen, to be still. The signal might rise for only a moment, then vanish. But in that brief arc of visibility, connection had been made. The message was not in the words, but in the awareness shared between sender and receiver. So, as we reflect on the place of smoke in daily life, we see a pattern that is not about drama, but about rhythm, about the pulse of movement across the land, about living in relationship with distance and time. The signals were not grand or poetic. They were quiet, consistent, and profoundly human. In the same way that footprints on a trail or the bend of a branch told a story, so too did the smoke. A village speaking not with noise, but with grace. A people staying close, even when far apart. A world where every column of smoke was a sign that life continued and that someone, somewhere, was watching the sky. Beyond the practical, beyond even the ceremonial, lies a third realm, a world of myth. Every culture, across every era, has wrapped its tools and customs in stories. For Native American communities, smoke signals were no exception. They weren't just signals, they were spirit. They weren't just communication, they were communion. In the eyes of many elders and storytellers, smoke did not merely rise because of fire and wind. It rose because it was called to rise. It carried not just messages to people, but messages to the sky, to the ancestors, to forces unseen. In this chapter, we wander into that sacred space between belief and breath, where smoke was a bridge between the human and the divine. Among the Lakota, there is a story told about the first fire. In the beginning, it is said, humans and the spirits lived close together, separated only by a veil as thin as breath. But the people grew distant, distracted, forgetful of the old ways. The spirits, saddened, withdrew to the sky. One day, a woman of the people lit a fire and whispered a song into it. As the smoke rose, her words were carried upward. The spirits, hearing her song, looked down and smiled. From that day forward, the story goes, smoke became a language one that even silence could understand. To send smoke was to remember. To receive it was to be remembered. Other stories speak of smoke as a living being. In Cherokee oral traditions, smoke is personified as a messenger spirit, swift and loyal. It travels not only between villages, but between worlds. A child lost in the forest might be found because the smoke had whispered their name to a nearby scout. A dream carried through smoke would arrive, somehow, in another's sleep. In these tales, smoke does not merely move, it listens, it chooses. It is not tamed by the fire. It partners with it, dances with it, to deliver meaning that cannot be spoken. Among the Blackfeet, there is an old tale of two brothers separated by a storm while hunting. One brother, afraid and alone, built a fire on a tall ridge and released a signal 3 puffs, as they had agreed. But the wind was too strong and the smoke scattered. The brother sat down, certain he would never be found. But high above, the thunderbirds saw the boy and bent the clouds around his fire, calming the air. His smoke rose clearly, and the other brother saw it from the far side of the valley. In time, they were reunited. The lesson, the elders say, is that even smoke may falter, but not if the spirits wish it to be seen. Some myths connect smoke signals with the stars. Among the Navajo, the Milky Way is sometimes described as a trail of ancient smoke, a path lit by the messages of the first people. In winter, when signal fires were rare, elders would point to the sky and remind the young ones, even when we send no smoke, the old messages are still there. The stars, in this belief, remember everything the smoke has ever said. They are not just distant suns, they are listening fires, still glowing with the stories of the earth. In other traditions, smoke signals were tied to the land itself. A particular hill, canyon, or lake might be known as a place of rising, where the smoke always spoke more clearly. These sites were considered sacred not because of any building or altar, but because of the role they played in memory. An old pine stump might be left untouched for generations, because that is where the ancestors sent their messages. To climb the hill, light a fire, and send smoke from that place was not just communication, it was ritual reenactment. The fire was new, but the act was ancient. Dreams, too, played a role in smoke mythology. It was not uncommon for a signaler to receive their calling in a dream, a vision of fire, of puffs rising in rhythm, of distant watchers nodding in reply. These signs were taken seriously. A person who dreamt of smoke might wake knowing that they had a duty to learn the codes, to study the winds, to serve their people as a watcher. These dreams were not seen as metaphors, but as callings, assignments whispered into the soul by forces older than fire. Animals appeared in these stories as well. Ravens were said to carry smoke on their wings. Coyotes, ever the tricksters, might mimic a signal to lead travelers astray unless the traveler was clever enough to notice the difference in rhythm. In some regions, it was said that wolves could see smoke messages. No human could detect shadows within the plume, meanings hidden in the curl. These tales were told not to confuse, but to deepen respect. Smoke was not just a line in the sky, it was a vessel of wisdom, wild and unpredictable, deserving of care. Perhaps the most tender of smoke myths is one told by the Salish. In it, an old man loses his voice and can no longer speak to his family. They worry for him, for how can he share his stories, his memories? One day, the man walks alone to the forest, gathers wood, and lights a small fire. He shapes the smoke carefully, as he once shaped his words. His family, seeing the plume, understands. He is telling his stories again in the only way he can. And so they sit and watch the smoke rise, listening not with ears, but with hearts. From then on, the story says, the Salish believed that even the voiceless could still be heard if they had smoke and sky, and someone to watch. In these myths, we see smoke signals not only as tools, but as sacred threads that tie the people to each other, to the land, to the past, and to the world beyond. We see a reverence that goes beyond technique, a belief that every puff carries more than a message. It carries memory, spirit, connection. And while these stories differ in their telling, they all agree on one thing: smoke does not lie. It speaks only what the heart intends. It cannot be hoarded. It cannot be hidden. It must rise and vanish, and trust that someone is watching. As we close this chapter and move back into the history of practice and legacy, we carry with us these stories not as facts to be proven, but as truths to be remembered. In the curls of old smoke, in the echo of a signal now long gone, there lingers the possibility that something more was said than we can know, that the fire did not just burn, that the smoke did not just rise, that the sky, for a moment, opened its ear and heard. All traditions, no matter how deeply rooted, how gracefully practiced, or how beautifully integrated into daily life, eventually meet moments of fracture. Sometimes the fracture comes from within, through gradual change, a forgetting, a shift in values. But sometimes it is imposed from outside, sudden and sharp. The story of smoke signals in Native American life does not end in firelight and song. It ends, more often, in silence. As settlers expanded westward, as railroads carved lines across ancient hunting grounds, and as U.S. government policies forcibly reshaped indigenous life, the use of smoke as a living language began to vanish. In this chapter, we examine that disappearance not as an end, but as a fading echo, a message scattered by history's winds. The decline did not begin all at once. For many tribes, smoke signals remained a vital tool well into the 1800s, especially in regions where terrain still made overland travel slow and difficult. Plains tribes like the Comanche and Lakota continued to rely on them for intergroup coordination, especially during buffalo hunts or in times of military threat. But even during this period, the pressure was mounting. American forts, telegraph stations, and military patrols increasingly monitored visible ridgelines and high points. Signal fires, once trusted messengers, became targets. Any rising smoke might be interpreted as a warning of impending attack, regardless of its true purpose. With the introduction of the telegraph, information moved faster than any rider or puff of smoke could travel. In many cases, tribes themselves began to recognize the efficiency of the new system, even as they remained wary of its reach. Some indigenous scouts working with or near military outposts learned to interpret and sometimes manipulate telegraph systems for their own uses. But for the broader tribal populations, smoke signaling remained the preferred method, not because they lacked innovation, but because smoke still belonged to them. It required no wires, no permissions, no foreign languages. It was rooted in the land and in memory. And yet, with each new wave of westward expansion, more signal points were occupied or disrupted. Hills where families once watched for returning hunters were now occupied by homesteaders or mining camps. Fires lit on ancient ceremonial ridges drew suspicion. Some tribes were banned from lighting fires altogether, especially in regions affected by settler panic during periods of conflict. As traditional trails were cut off and mobility restricted, the network of communication, the physical geography on which smoke signaling depended, began to unravel. A signal fire without a watcher is a whisper into darkness. Without open land and mutual codes, the smoke had nowhere to go. government policies accelerated the decline. The reservation system imposed across most of North America during the late 19th century forced many tribes into smaller, tightly monitored spaces. These reserves were often far from ancestral lands, lacking the visibility and distance necessary for effective signaling. Fires were watched closely, sometimes forbidden entirely. Young people sent to boarding schools were prohibited from speaking their own languages, let alone practicing ancestral arts like smoke communication. With each generation, fewer children grew up learning how to shape puffs, how to read the wind, how to understand the silent meanings behind a distant plume. There are records of resistance. In the early 20th century, during moments of crisis or gathering, smoke signals were revived, briefly lit at the edges of reservations, in remote valleys, or during cultural ceremonies held in defiance of federal bans. Elders passed on what they remembered to those willing to listen. A few signals rose into the sky again, not as practical tools, but as acts of cultural persistence. But by then, their function had changed. Smoke was no longer the language of daily life. It had become symbol nostalgic, powerful, and endangered. It's important to remember that the loss was not just technological, it was emotional. Smoke signaling was a form of belonging, a way of knowing that your people were near, that your movements were seen, your absence felt, your return welcomed. Its disappearance left behind more than a void in communication. It left a void in relationship. Where once the land was stitched together by invisible lines of trust and breath, there was now silence, dense, imposed, and unkind. In some areas, elders continued to light small signal fires for ceremonial purposes, especially during naming rites, funerals, or seasonal transitions. These weren't functional messages, but offerings. They told the ancestors, "We have not forgotten." They told the land, "We are still here." But even these gestures grew rarer as fire restrictions, urbanization, and cultural assimilation took deeper root. By the mid-20th century, outside of a few isolated communities, smoke signaling as a living practice had all but disappeared. Anthropologists and historians, recognizing the loss, began to document what they could, though often too late to capture the full richness of the tradition. They interviewed elders, scoured settler journals, and published papers filled with diagrams and theories. But the scholars often focused on the signals themselves, the codes, the puffs, the shapes rather than the lived experience of signaling. They missed the stillness, the patience, the feeling of standing on a ridge, shaping breath into meaning, waiting for an answer. What they recorded was useful, but partial. The heart of the practice had already faded into memory. Still, some pieces endured. Stories told around fires, ridges remembered by name, children who asked what their grandparents meant when they said, "This is where we used to speak to the wind." In these fragments, something survived, not the system, but the spirit. The knowledge that we once lived in such connection that we could send thoughts without speaking, that the air itself could carry our care, that the sky could listen if we shaped the smoke just right. So, the disappearance of smoke signals is not a story of failure, it is a story of interruption. A language silenced, not forgotten. A practice paused, not lost. Like the embers of an old fire, buried in ash, it waits. And in the chapters ahead, we will see how those embers have been stirred again. How artists, elders, and youth are finding new ways to honor the signers, to remember the messages, and perhaps to light new fires, not only for history's sake, but for the sake of connection itself. The wind, after all, still moves, and the sky still watches. Though smoke signals seemed to vanish in the face of modernity, their story did not end with their disappearance. In recent decades, a quiet resurgence has begun, rooted in memory, sustained by curiosity, and sparked by a collective desire to reconnect with lost traditions. Across reservations, cultural centers, and university classrooms, Native Americans and allies alike are rediscovering the language of smoke. This chapter is about those rediscoveries, how signal fires are once again being lit, how young people are learning to read the wind, and how ancient knowledge is finding new breath in the present. The earliest flickers of revival came not from governments or institutions, but from elders, individuals who remembered the old ways and began to share them with a new generation. Some spoke of signal fires used during their youth for ceremonies or informal communication. Others passed down specific codes, rhythms, or techniques used by their grandparents or great-grandparents. These teachings were often informal, shared during long walks, family gatherings, or tribal events. At first, they were acts of memory, but gradually they became acts of revival. In places like the northern plains, tribal schools began incorporating traditional fire building and signaling into cultural curriculum. Students would learn not only how to construct a fire for warmth or cooking, but how to shape its smoke, how to time puffs, how to choose locations, how to interpret the behavior of the wind. These lessons were not simply technical. They taught patience, observation, and a sense of connection to the land. Young people were encouraged to see smoke not just as fire's byproduct, but as its voice, a voice that could still be heard if one knew how to listen. Cultural festivals and powwows, too, became places of experimentation. In the open fields surrounding drum circles and dancers, some groups began to demonstrate smoke signaling not as spectacle, but as homage. A small fire would be lit near the edge of the grounds. A signaler, dressed in traditional clothing or contemporary wear, would perform a simple sequence, perhaps 3 puffs for welcome, or a single column for remembrance. Spectators, some familiar with the tradition and others encountering it for the first time, would watch in respectful silence. For many, the sight of that smoke was moving not because of what it said, but because of what it remembered. In academic settings, researchers with indigenous roots began reevaluating old accounts. They combed through journals, missionary reports, and military records, not to exoticize the practice, but to reclaim it. They interviewed elders, cross-referenced tribal oral traditions, and rebuilt regional codes once thought lost. Some wrote papers, others created interactive exhibits or workshops. What emerged was not a universal dictionary of smoke language, but a mosaica recognition that each tribe's use of smoke was unique, contextual, and worthy of preservation on its own terms. Technology, once the reason for smoke signaling's decline, has also become a surprising ally in its rebirth. Digital archives, podcasts, and video tutorials now share knowledge that once required face-to-face transmission. A teenager on a reservation in Montana can watch a firekeeper from Arizona demonstrate how to produce a clean smoke column. A student in a cultural preservation course can download animations showing historical signaling patterns. Online forums allow users to ask questions, share footage of practice signals, or collaborate on cultural mapping projects that mark traditional signal points. The sky may be digital now, but the desire to communicate within it remains the same. Artists and storytellers have also joined the revival, using smoke as metaphor and medium. Poets speak of breath and flame, of messages that vanish but never die. Painters depict signalers silhouetted against twilight skies, their smoke curling upward into constellations of memory. Filmmakers craft scenes where the return of a single signal rekindles community. These works, often shared at festivals or posted online, create new associations between the ancient and the contemporary. They remind viewers that tradition is not frozen in time. It adapts, it speaks again in different tongues and forms. In some communities, the signal fire has found its way into ceremony once more, not as communication tool, but as sacred symbol. During funerals, a signal may be sent at the moment of burial, rising slowly as a final goodbye. During youth coming-of-age ceremonies, a single puff may mark the transition from child to adult. These moments are deeply personal. They are not meant to revive an old network, but to honor a lineage, to say, quietly and clearly, we remember how we used to speak, and we still speak in our way. One particularly beautiful development has been the use of smoke signals in cross-generational healing. Families torn apart by boarding school trauma or cultural suppression have come together through the rediscovery of shared practice. A grandparent might teach a grandchild how to shape smoke. The child, in turn, might document the process with video or sketches, preserving the moment not in memory alone, but in shared creation. The act of sending a signal, however symbolic, becomes a gesture of connection between generations, once kept apart by silence and shame. And yet, even as smoke signals return to cultural life, their new role is not the same as before. They are not used to warn of enemies or organize a hunt. They are not the central nervous system of a nomadic society. Instead, they have become vessels carriers of memory, embodiments of survival. When a signal rises now, it is not only a message to someone watching from another hill. It is a message to time itself. We are still here. We remember. We have not forgotten how to speak skyward. Of course, not all revivals are perfect or permanent. Some efforts fade. Some encounters feel shallow. And there remains the constant challenge of ensuring that such practices are preserved respectfully, without turning them into mere performance or novelty. Elders caution that a signal without understanding is just smoke. It must be sent with care, with intention, with knowledge. The goal is not to rebuild the past exactly as it was, but to let its spirit live again in ways suited to today. As we draw this chapter to a close, we are left with a sense of quiet hope. The sky, after all, is still above us. The wind still moves, and the knowledge, though once nearly extinguished, is still glowing in a few hands, a few hearts, a few hillsides. If smoke was once the thread that bound together families, seasons, and sacred times, perhaps it can be again, only now and then, if only briefly, in gestures that say more than words ever could. In the next chapter, we will turn to the lessons smoke signaling offers to the modern world, not as a technology to replicate, but as a wisdom to reflect on, a reminder of what it means to connect, to wait, to watch, and to trust that even the faintest message, if sent with care, may one day be received. Yet even in absence, the smoke teaches. It lingers in the bones of those who once watched the sky for messages. It lives in the stories told quietly at dusk, in the way children still pause and look up when a chimney plume bends on the wind. For all its transience, smoke offers enduring lessons about communication, about patience, about community. This chapter is not about technique nor revival, but about meaning. What did the smoke signals teach us? not might they still teach us now. The first lesson is simplicity. A smoke signal did not attempt to say everything. It said only what needed to be said. 3 puffs, 1 long trail, a pause. The signaler did not ramble. They waited for the right time. They chose their moment. They shaped it with care. In a world now overwhelmed by constant connection where we can speak at any moment, across any distance, there is something quietly powerful in that restraint. The smoke reminds us that a message is more than content. It is timing, intention, and attention. It is not how much we say, but whether we are heard. The second lesson is silence. Smoke signals were silent. They rose without fanfare, spoke without sound, and yet they reached farther than shouts, faster than footsteps. There is wisdom in that kind of communication, a way of speaking that does not interrupt, that does not demand, that simply exists and waits to be received. Today, we are often taught to speak quickly, to respond instantly, to keep the noise going. But the smoke teaches a different rhythm, one of quiet offering. A message does not have to shout to be meaningful. It only has to be seen. Third is the lesson of place. Smoke signaling was not abstract. It was rooted literally in the land. A signal could only be sent from certain points. It could only be seen from certain paths. The geography mattered. The wind mattered. To send a signal was to know your place in the world, not just metaphorically, but physically. You had to know the ridges, the valleys, the weather. You had to read the land like a map. In a time when many of us are disconnected from our environment, the practice of smoke reminds us to reorient, to know where we are, to pay attention to the shape of the hills and the lean of the trees. Communication is not just about content. It is about context. The fourth lesson is patience. A signaler might wait for hours, even days, for the right moment to send a message. The fire would be tended, the materials gathered. The watcher would scan the horizon. And when the time came, when the wind slowed, when the air cleared, they would send the smoke. And then they would wait again. There was no instant reply. There was only the hope that the signal was seen. In that space of waiting, something important happened. Trust in the message, trust in the receiver, trust in the connection, even if unseen. In modern life, where impatience is built into our devices, this lesson is radical. To send something out and wait not with anxiety, but with trustees to live differently, to believe, even in silence, that someone is listening. The fifth lesson is community. Smoke signaling was never solitary. Even when performed by a lone signaler, it was part of a shared system. The codes had to be agreed upon. The meanings had to be known. The watchers had to be ready. A message was only complete when it was received and understood. This interdependence teaches us something vital. The communication is not about broadcasting, it is about relationship, about knowing who is watching, who is listening, and how they might interpret what you send. It reminds us that messages are shared spaces, not monologues, that we shape meaning together, not alone. The sixth lesson is impermanence. Smoke vanishes. It does not linger. A message rises, drifts, and disappears. There is no archive, no replay, no screenshot, and yet the message is real. It is seen. It matters. This is a hard lesson for modern minds. We are used to permanence, to records, to proof, to documentation. But smoke teaches us to value the moment, to trust that even fleeting connection can be meaningful, that just because something does not last does not mean it lacks worth. Like a sunset, like laughter, like a kind word, its beauty is in its brevity. Eighth is the lesson of resilience. Smoke signaling, for all its fragility, persisted for centuries. It crossed deserts, forests, mountains. It adapted to weather, to war, to change. It was flexible, creative, and endlessly responsive to the conditions around it. In this, it mirrors the story of the native peoples who created it resilient, enduring, shaped by hardship but not destroyed by it. The smoke teaches us that strength is not about force, it is about adaptability, about bending like smoke, not breaking like stone. And finally, there is the lesson of legacy. The signalers are mostly gone. Their fires are cold, but the memory remains. The codes live on in stories. The ridges are still there, and the sky, ever patient, still waits. Smoke reminds us that messages do not have to be carved in stone to endure. They endure in memory, in practice, in the quiet choices of those who carry the knowledge forward. Legacy is not about monuments. It is about breath, about what we send into the world and what we leave behind for others to watch for. So what can smoke signals teach us today? That less is more, that silence speaks, that place matters, that patience is powerful, that communication is relationship, that impermanence is not weakness, that responsibility matters, that resilience is quiet, and that legacy is shaped not by permanence, but by care. In the final chapter, we will look not backward, but forward. What does the legacy of smoke signals mean for the future? Not just of native storytelling, but of human connection itself. What does it mean to be a sender in a noisy world? And what might it mean to be the one who, even now, still watches the sky? A puff of smoke rises into the sky. It curls, stretches, catches the light, and then vanishes. For centuries, this quiet act carried weight, announcing arrivals, warning of danger, calling for aid, marking ceremonies, speaking to the ancestors. Now, in the modern world, few fires are built for such purpose. Yet the echoes remain. Even as the smoke fades, its influence lingers. It shaped how people moved across the land, how they saw each other, how they remembered. And now, it shapes how we imagine the past, how we learn from it, and how we speak to the future. In this final chapter, we consider the legacy of Native American smoke signaling, not just as a historical practice, but as a living symbol of connection, resilience, and meaning in a fast, fractured world. The most visible part of this legacy lies in the cultural memory of Native communities. Even when the codes are forgotten, even when the technique is no longer practiced, the presence of smoke signaling remains a quiet pride. It is remembered not simply as a tool, but as a sign of intelligence, innovation, and presence. When young people today learn that their ancestors could speak across miles with no wires, no machines, no spoken words, only with fire, air, and rhythm, they are often struck with awe. It challenges the stereotypes of primitiveness that colonization once imposed. It reveals that native life was and is technologically adaptive, elegant, and deeply in tune with the environment. This legacy also lives on in language and symbol. Phrases like sending a signal or watching the horizon carry echoes of the old practice. In some tribal languages, the words for message or warning are rooted in terms that once described fire or rising air. Even outside indigenous cultures, smoke remains a powerful metaphor. We say there's smoke, so there must be fire, to speak of unseen truths. We light candles in memory, send flares for help, use incense for prayer. All these rituals, however distanced from their origins, speak to a universal idea that smoke carries intention, that it rises for a reason. In the world of visual culture, smoke signaling has left an indelible mark. It appears in paintings, in film, in poetry, often inaccurately portrayed, reduced to caricature, or used as a shorthand for the exotic, but still present. And in recent decades, native artists and storytellers have begun reclaiming that imagery. They paint signalers not as silent figures on the periphery, but as central actors in the story. Their smoke is no longer backgrounded voice. Contemporary art exhibitions have featured interactive installations where visitors walk through mist and light, mimicking the experience of reading a smoke signal in motion. These works are not about nostalgia. They are about continuity, about making the unseen seen again. The legacy of smoke signals also lives in how we think about communication itself. At a time when information moves at the speed of thought, when messages arrive in floods rather than flutters, the model of the smoke signal invites a pause. It reminds us that meaningful communication is not just about speed or reach, it's about care, about being present enough to read the sky, about being patient enough to wait for the right moment, about trusting that what we send, if shaped with honesty, might be received even if it drifts for a while before finding its watcher. Educators and historians are now exploring smoke signals not only as cultural artifacts, but as case studies in environmental literacy, teaching students how smoke moved through landscapes, how wind patterns and elevation shaped messages, how observation of the natural world was critical to success. These lessons offer more than historical knowledge. They offer a model for how to live attentively, how to be in tune with place, not just in movement, but in meaning. In this way, smoke signaling becomes a portal, not just to the past, but to a deeper kind of presence. In intergenerational storytelling, too, the legacy continues. A grandparent tells a child that hill there deaths where we used to send smoke, and the child, wide-eyed, begins to imagine. They may never light a signal fire themselves, but they will carry the shape of that memory. They will know that the land once spoke in columns of breath, that people once waited, not with phones in hand, but with eyes to the sky. And perhaps they will carry that sense of watchfulness into their own lives, not just looking for smoke, but for signs, for meaning, for connection. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this legacy is what it suggests about the future. In a world that often feels disconnected, where noise is constant and attention fleeting, the idea of smoke as communication feels almost revolutionary. What if we slowed down? What if we shaped our messages more carefully? What if we trusted that sometimes the quietest signals are the most powerful? Smoke signals remind us that communication is not just about what is said, but about how, when, and why. They ask us to be more intentional, to be more rooted, to speak, even if only briefly, with the whole of our presence. As indigenous communities continue to preserve and revitalize their traditions, smoke signals serve not only as heritage, but as possibility. They remind us that the tools of the past can still guide the choices of the present, that even ephemeral practices, those that leave no trace scan, have lasting impact, and that legacy is not a matter of what endures physically, but what continues to move through the heart, the hand, the breath. We close this story not with a conclusion, but with a gesture, a slow, rising column of imagined smoke. A final message sent not across miles, but across time, to those who once signaled, to those who watched, to those who kept the fire, and to those who now carry it forward. The signal is simple. It says, we remember, we honor, we still watch the sky, and perhaps Somewhere, someone is watching too, and they understand.